Good afternoon. This panel is a live taping of the New Ideal podcast. We've never had a live taping, so this is exciting for us. We will release this in a couple of days on our YouTube channel. You get to be part of a modest step in history. We're getting a live taping. And the theme of today's discussion is fueling an intellectual movement. And with me today are three scholars in the Objectivist intellectual community that I'm really proud to be on stage with. I admire them. I've learned so much from them. And what I'd like to do is talk about two celebrations today. Two landmarks, I think, in the growth of the intellectual movement around objectivism. So let me just introduce our panelists. For those of you who might be watching on YouTube or don't know who everyone is, let's start on the far end with Greg Salmieri, who is a senior scholar of philosophy at the Salem Center at University of Texas at Austin. Robert Mayhew is a professor of philosophy at Seton Hall University and also a board member of the Ayn Rand Institute. And Tara Smith, a professor of philosophy at University of Texas at Austin, also a board member of the Ayn Rand Institute. So there are two celebrations. I want to start with both some context for the issue of fueling an intellectual movement and just to tell you what the two landmark achievements are, the two celebrations, and then we'll dive into details about them. One is, and this happened some time ago, the publication of 4 collections of essays around Ayn Rand's novels, both literary, historical, and philosophical analysis that Robert Mayhew was the editor of, and we'll talk about those, where those all happened many years ago, but the reason we're resurfacing them now is that we republished them on New Ideal on the web. And the Ayn Rand Institute took great pains to license those books to make the content of these path-breaking essays available online to everyone for free across the globe. So that's a big landmark for us. That's one celebration. The second celebration is one that happened today. So today at the benefactors lunch, just a while ago, we distributed for the first time copies of the First Amendment, the book that Tara has brought out, and we'll talk more about that. So that is I'm very excited about that. And for those of you who are at the lunch, I hope you got a chance to pick up your complimentary copy. If you did, I can see someone shaking her head. We'll make sure you get a copy. And if those of you who weren't at the lunch, the book is now on Amazon in Kindle and paperback. And we'll get to that in a moment. All right, so what I'd like to do is to start with a wider perspective on intellectual movements, how ideas spread, and to think about the place of objectivism in that context. So objectivism is an intellectual movement. What are things we can learn about other movements that have succeeded? What did they do? How does that relate to objectivism? What's different? What's distinctive? So maybe we could start with the role of ideas in advancing a movement. And I'm interested in some historical context or examples that you might think of. Let me put the question this way. So we can think of movements that have malign goals, like Marxism as an intellectual enterprise. We can think of movements that have positive goals, like the abolitionist movement in the United States. Thinking in that wide frame, how do you think about the role of spreading ideas, publishing for the advancement of objectivism and its goals? So let me open that up to whoever wants to jump in on that. All right, I'm going to pick you, Greg. Let's do it.
Well, okay, so the role of ideas in advancing a movement is ideological. What we're talking about is movements of ideas, so the whole thing is advancing ideas. But the role of publishing in different forms, I think there are sort of two things that are going on in an ideological movement. An ideological movement is a set of ideas that are abstract philosophical ideas and therefore applicable in any time and place, but also being used by people as a guide to their life, as a guide to understanding their present society, and as a tool, therefore, for thinking about how to change and alter that society. And so what an ideological movement needs is sort of two types of thing, right? Two types of content that are coming out. a timeless type of content, a content that's about, this is the fundamental ideas, this is how epistemology works, this is how values and knowledge work, and then a journalistic, engaged with the concretes of the moment type of content. This is what's wrong with this law, this is how to think about these two political candidates. Whatever the thing is in the moment, that as you're going through life and seeing the concretes, you get guidance about how to integrate them in light of these ideas. But it's not just the two extremes, a newspaper article and a philosophy book. There are all kinds of intermediate stops along there that are more and less durable, long-term in scale. So take a movement that's not as abstract a philosophical movement as, Aristotelianism or Marxism or something. Take abolitionism, that's concerned with a particular project of ending slavery, right? There are books, and books that are classics of it, like My Bondage and My Freedom, or Narrative of My Time as a Slave, the Frederick Douglass books, right? And there was also newspapers that are commenting on the events of the day, and both of them were essential. And they're essential in a way that interlocks, because the topical, changing moment-to-moment context is relying on and referring people to a more enduring content that's not as engaged with the affairs of the moment, but is abstracting one level from them, that can be read year after year, decade after decade. And if we look at what's happening now in objectivism, we have both types of things, and we need both types of things. So we have Yaron Brook on the air every day, interpreting the events of the day in a philosophical framework. We have New Ideal Live. We have various things like this that are topical, local content. And then we have Atlas Shrugged, The Virtue of Selfishness, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, as the kind of background, wide-ranging content that this is drawing our attention to. If you think about Ayn Rand herself, this is also what she was doing, right? The Objectivist, the Ayn Rand newsletter about the journalistic concretes of the day, relating them to Atlas Shrugged. But we also need things that are building on what Rand wrote, that are building on her timeless things, and building on the timely things she wrote in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that are available today to do with the essential issues as they're existing in the world today, but today meaning not on the scale of months or weeks, but on the scale of years and decades. And I think that's what books are for. That's the role they play.
Yeah.
So one comment, not just on books, but just more broadly on ideas, and this is just a challenge that's somewhat distinctive to objectivism, I think, because when you think about other ideological movements and political movements like abolitionism or environmentalism or women's rights, voting rights back in the day, and so on. I mean, they're all much narrower, even Marxism, still narrower than whole philosophical framework, right? Soup to nuts, metaphysics, the works. So it's harder for us as an intellectual movement. It's easier for others, I think, to patch together coalitions that can help them be effective over a period of a few decades and so on. So I just think one of the interesting challenges for objectivism is, whereas a lot of that other stuff can reside on the implicit altruism and even collectivism in some cases, obviously in some cases that's exactly what they're going for, but no, we're upending the things people take for granted, which just makes it more difficult at that level. No, I can come back and say more about the books, articles, things if you want yet, or we can go further.
I would just add to that another challenge is the kind of audiences we're aiming at. I mean, some of the things in a movement that you're writing are pretty much aimed, I don't like the expression preaching to the choir, but you're aiming at educating people who are interested in objectivism. And then there are pieces that are aimed, mostly what you described, at a general public, intelligent people anywhere. And then there are books that are aimed at academics, for example. You're trying to get, let's say, philosophy departments, academic philosophers interested in the ideas of Ayn Rand. And so you're going to try to write a book in a certain way, try to get it published with a certain kind of press. And that's a challenge too. And it's something we have to think about when we're thinking about book-length projects.
Let me jump back to what you were saying, Tara. I would like to hear more about this. So there's a fragment from Ayn Rand that I often refer to in this context, and she says in the essay, What Can One Do, I believe, books, essays, articles, she sees those as, quote, the permanent fuel of an intellectual movement. So it would be interesting to hear a bit about how you think about different forms of writing, different scales, and Robert's already brought up the topic of different audiences and sort of the strategic, tactical perspective. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, books, so I agree with what Greg was saying, that you need both kinds of, I mean, both, just broadly speaking, the kind of more periodical, speaking to issues of the day, and the more timeless, the more lasting. So I definitely think there's a really important role for books, even today, even while books may not have the monopoly that they had on certain intellectual attention that they had just a few decades ago even. A book transmits a different message, just it projects. This is to be of enduring value. You could pick this up in 5 years. You could pick this up in 10 years. Now, obviously, it's going to vary a little bit with the book, its nature, its exact subject, but this is meant to last. So it just projects a certain series. You know, newspapers we crumple and we throw and we put the paintbrush on them or whatever, right? Books, some people don't even want to write in their book, right? Because, no, this is hardbound. Okay. So it projects that message, but what that is supposed to be based on is the author. He took time, and this is more deeply, and I just think this is something we need to keep in mind as we are interested in producing more books, right? Quality counts and depth of, I mean, what a book should be is, no, we're going deeper into this. This subject, and what I want to say about this subject is sufficiently complicated that it really requires being much more informed, much more considered, much more carefully and thoroughly argued. And you're kind of making like by having a book on something, you're making a certain promise to the would-be reader, right? So it's a bigger investment on his part, and it's important that you really deliver on that. But when well done, that kind of thing is what people can come back to. What they, you know, the young people today, or the people who discover objectivism in 20 years or whatever, they're the foundational pieces that elaborate the philosophy. There's obviously what Ayn Rand herself wrote and what others have written, but more elaborations of the guts of it all, in different ways, and some books can be on more applied things. But there's a kind of longevity that reflects a depth and a seriousness of, I mean, in a way, books really take ideas seriously. You gotta think about this one deeply, and if it warrants a real book length treatment, and that's some of the value we can get from them.
Well, there's still more to talk about. One of our goals today is to open up the floor and get questions from you. So be thinking about things you'd want to raise later on. We'll come back to audience questions. Let's turn to the series of books that you edited, Robert. The 4 essays on Ayn Rand's anthem, We the Living, Found Head and Atlas Shrugged. And we were just talking about the different considerations, and so maybe let's start with the genesis of this project and how you saw the audience for this. Was it primarily trying to connect academic audiences to Ayn Rand, open up conversations, or was it more oriented to people who are already knowledgeable? Just set the stage for us.
Right, well, in a way, it was trying to aim at both, in a certain sense that I'll talk about. But the genesis of it, and I'm very proud of this, was really just me. In the sense that, sorry, that sounds obnoxious, but that is, I had this idea that we'd reached a point in the culture there that I might be able to find an academic press that could publish. I had the idea of starting with We the Living, but essays on each one of the novels. And that was part of the reason why I thought this was the right time. We'd also reached the point where in the movement there were really good people who would write these essays even if the top tier objectivist intellectuals didn't want to. So I knew that even if Leonard Peikoff and Harry Binswanger weren't interested in writing for this project, there'd be these guys, or actually, Greg you were young once, and
weren't we all?
Well, we'll get back to that in a moment, because I think Greg was really important to this project. But so I had this idea, and I was very committed to starting with We the Living, and so it was. I thought the time was right that an academic press might go for it. We had enough people who could write these essays. I wanted them to be historical. I wanted them to include historical essays, and the archives was just getting going. I knew that was an important thing. And what else did I wrote down my extemporaneous notes, or comments. My best friend, Tora Buckman, was doing what I thought was really brilliant work in literary aesthetics, and I thought there would be an opportunity for him to, it would provide a vehicle for him to get published. And then the more personal motive was that although my field is in ancient philosophy, I found doing these projects in the previous decade, the Marginalia and the Art of Nonfiction, editing those works, that I really liked having an Ayn Rand project at the same time as I was doing work in ancient philosophy. So I was starting to work on the Q&A and the Song of Russia book. So those were Ayn Rand projects, but I wanted something in the future. So that's really what it happened, how it got started. And I wrote independent without asking the other parties. I sent out letters to various academic presses, and I started writing to the potential contributors, and it all really worked out.
So give us sort of the timing. So this was early 2000s that you got this kicked off?
This was, and the other thing was, and another thing, I did not want these books to be held up. Some academics have a reputation for, the Urban Dictionary defines deadline as that date about which you begin work on a project. And I've experienced that in academia, and I didn't want that to happen to these books. I wanted I wanted the people to have enough time to write really good essays, but that nothing would be held up. And I think everyone cooperated. It worked out really well. So We the Living was published in 2004, Anthem 2005, Fountainhead 2007, and Atlas Shrugged in 2009. So we got them in the first decade of the year. So that was, that's how it happened. So.
One of the things I've heard you say, and I think you've written this as well, Greg, is that there's OPAR, Objectivist in the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff, is a milestone that then creates a growing swell of new scholarship, and of which I think these 4 books are an example. And I'm interested in hearing from you all as contributors to these books, how you approached what you picked, and then did you find that you were learning things in the process of writing these essays? I'd love to hear more about open the curtain for us a bit, Robert, in terms of how this happens and some of the collaborative work that goes on. I know I was present at one of the workshops around Anthem. I just got to sit in on it. And Anthem, I think this happened. And I was really impressed that, I didn't know this sort of thing happened in academia because I'm not part of that world, but I was really impressed with the trading of essays and drafts. So I'd love to, maybe you could just tell us about the process of how this came about and your learning around that.
Well, that didn't happen with We the Living, but it did. I started going to ARI for funding, and thank you, donors. We would hold workshops and things like that. But I think we did that with Anthem, and then the other ones. But I don't.
So Anthem is the one for which I did not write an essay. You asked me, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anthem's hard. I always found Anthem kind of hard, and I've come to appreciate it much more over the years, but I found that a really difficult one. But the first, like We the Living, there was no workshop on.
No, there wasn't a workshop.
I don't recall workshops on the other 2, though.
There was one on Atlas.
There was definitely one on Atlas. I'm not sure about the Fountainhead.
Okay.
But
I will I learned a lot from writing the essays that I did for the 3 books that I did. And in the one case, for Atlas, I think I wrote 2 essays. But, it's...
Yeah, I have a story about that.
This is a familiar idea. Okay, good. At any rate, familiar idea that it's when you go to teach something or write on something that you have to really know what you're talking about. So with We the Living, which is a book I always loved. I just love We the Living. But, when you're going to write an essay on... I forget what mine was called, something like Forbidding Life to Those Still Living, but I really examined, the way in which it smothers the collectivism, the government collectivism, just smothers the soul so completely, the spiritual demolition, and so on. And the other one I would say, in particular, that I learned a lot from writing was for the Atlas collection. I forget what it's called, No Tributes to Caesar, or something like that, where I really
Good
go
or
into
evil.
the either-or nature of the choices, and they're not like, why does she have to kill that guy in the end in the, when they're trying to rescue, what's his name? Golf. Anyway.
Yeah, I remember at the time, I really wanted, I had this idea for terror, and that's kind of more generally. In some cases, I want this person to write on this topic, and others, it's just, I want Greg to do something, but, And so in the case of Atlas, I remember I really wanted Tara, because she was doing great work in philosophy of law, I wanted her to write on the non-objectivity of law, as that's dealt with in the novel. And she said, no, I'd rather do this one, and I think we compromised, and she did both. And I remember you complained at a certain point.
No, but it was good, because I definitely learned from that one.
Well, it was more work, and that's always
but
not good.
that was okay.
Sorry, Greg.
That was well worth it.
I'll say something specific about what I learned writing for these, but I want to say something broader first, which is that Robert, in particular, in these books, deserve a lot more credit than they get, and they should be much more widely read. I think they represent an important moment in history, and it's really down to Robert's foresight in doing this that this happened. There was no such thing as Ayn Rand scholarship, or none worth giving a damn about before these books. That's not to say there weren't good books written by objectivists related to objectivism. Opar, of course, is magisterial and incredible. Tara had written 2 books, and many articles, but they're books that are expounding the truth. They're telling you, here's what's right in philosophy, which is important and good, but the most important thing ultimately. But a scholarly book is a book that takes as its subject of analysis not reality, but someone else's work. And so these books were the first books of any quality, not about the world, and we're giving Ayn Rand's perspective on what we learned from her, but about Ayn Rand as an author, as a thinker. And because she is so powerful and valuable as an author and a thinker, if you really study her as an object of thought, her works as object of study, you then learn things that you can then go back and then talk more intelligently about the world, because you have a perspective on it. And this is something a lot of us had done for Aristotle, including Robert, studying Aristotle and then learning what you can from him and talking about the world. And nobody had done that, had studied Ayn Rand as an author in the way that you would study Aristotle as a philosopher or Hugo as a literary author, or at least nobody had done it who was any good at it. And Robert got a lot of the best minds in objectivism, particularly of the younger generations in objectivism, himself and younger, not all that young, but not Leonard and Harry as much, and set them that project. And I think that led to an explosion of deepening all of our understandings of Rand, and through that deepening all of our understandings of reality. And I know that it did that for me, both in writing these pieces. I started thinking about her the way I was thinking about Aristotle, as someone to study rather than just someone to help me study the world. And then, having studied her, I could study the world with her aid better. And then how much I learned from the other people who were writing on it, and the ones that stand out are Torah's pieces in particular, Ankar, Darrell Wright, as well as my present company included. The main thing that the impact that it had on me was now here's an occasion to study, to make Rand and these specific works of hers objects of study. How do they work? How does the plots in these novels express philosophy? How are they constructed as literary works? How are they constructed as arguments, where the subject, again, isn't the facts that they're about, but these works. And in particular, taking them seriously as literature and taking seriously the idea of philosophical literature. It's not a philosophy and you have a story around it or something. It's a plot that is constructed philosophically. And it's fully as much a piece of philosophy as a treatise is, but it's a novel, and it's first and foremost a novel. And that way of thinking about them and thinking about her, which I had to do to work on that and make that more central to my thinking on her, was absolutely central to my own intellectual development. I suspect it was central to the way Ankar's thinking developed in these years, just looking at what he wrote and how he did it, and I think others too. So it was, I think, a real watershed. It was definitely, when Alan and I started planning the companion, our thinking about it was very much in line with, or mine with, something new is going on with these books. Robert, can we take that further? And I just think it's really important, and I don't think they're read enough.
Brief thing to add. So I definitely, there are some really, really excellent, illuminating essays in there by various people. And, when you're reading the novels, the stories are so damn good, you just want to keep going, and you keep going. And obviously you get, ooh, that's a really interesting idea, that's a really interesting idea. But you don't pause on it, because you want to know what happens next. But when you read these essays, it's like, oh, and that's why. That happened next. And oh, now I understand more deeply because of something that Daryl is explaining or Greg is explaining or something. Oh, now I understand the character more fully. So, so I really would recommend reading these collections.
I want to jump in right there because we were talking about, you were saying, Greg, more people should read these books. And if we can put up the slide. So this is one of the proudest things I can share with you in the last few years running content at the Institute and being one of the editors of New Ideal. This was a watershed for us to be able to license all 4 books and to publish, I think, 90% of the content on our publication New Ideal. I'm very proud of having made this happen along with my colleague Tom Bowden. And our thinking behind doing this was similar to what Greg was saying. I personally gained enormous value from this. Yaron had the same experience. Onkar, we were sitting around and we thought, let's see what we can do to get these books into the hands of students, and what can we do with the publishers. And let me just try to be polite about this, because there might be publishers listening, and I don't. We love publishers, not really. I have had conversations with people at publishing houses or in the publishing industry where I will say to them, tell me the number that will make this happen. And their answer is, no answer. They're not motivated by money, and they're not motivated by... So it's very hard to deal with people in the publishing industry, in my experience. Maybe there are great people that I have not yet met. So the frustration was, we wanted to promote these books. And I think there was even conversations 10 years ago about what can we do with this publisher and to accelerate the promotion and advertisement. And like a lot of things, we just decided, let's just go around them. Let's just get the content. Let's put it on the web. Let's invite everyone who is interested to explore this content. And this happened as partly for all those reasons that we thought there's long awaited growing audience for this, deserving of a larger audience. But we also were, as you know, as some of you know, our focus at the Institute became trained on the idea of growing Ayn Rand University and investing deeply and expansively in our educational programs. And it was a perfect alignment with that, because initially we thought, well, what if we just got all these books and every time someone enrolls in ARU, we'd ship them these 4 books, because we would want them to have the benefit of that. And we thought, well, why are we shipping them books? Why would we just unlock the content? So the primary audience for this is the universe of people interested in Ayn Rand, including researchers and scholars and journalists who will now have a valuable resource, and all the growing numbers of students in ARU. So for us, this was a win on multiple levels, and I'm really excited to have this. So for those of you who haven't explored these books or have only read 1 or 2 of them, now it's much easier, and I invite you to explore all of the essays, and they're collected in a special section on our website. So thank you all of you who are donors to the Institute who made this possible. This, I think, it's bringing all the incredible work that has been done to a much larger audience. I'm very proud to have a role in that. Now, I want to come back to you, Robert, to hear from the editor's perspective. I don't want to put you in an awkward position, but if you could just highlight a few things that you were very excited about or that you would want to highlight, favorite essays, things that you were happy to work on, things that you learned from. Open it up that way.
Yeah, that's... Well, I definitely like some essays better than others, but at a certain point, it's like, which child do you like better? And you want to be careful. And you can't really make a distinction. But I like Tora Buchmann's essays were, I thought, really excellent. And he didn't do anything for the We the Living collection, but he did for the other ones. Onkar's are really good. Very special. One of them in particular, kind of on a personal level, I like because it's where I really discovered Greg was something special, in the sense that when you came to me with the idea for the Anthem collection, you know, he was, well, I already made that joke that he was young then. And I was blown away by the proposal that what he intended to do with the essay, really discovering the method by which the hero of Anthem discovers the concept I. And then when he delivered the goods, like, okay, wow, this is someone who's I'm going to be learning from for a long, long time. I mentioned that I had the terror story of the 2 essays where I got 2 out of you. Ankar's are really good. Every one's, I think, a gem. Yeah, I think, and if I'd like to do something here because, as I said, I think Tora Buchman's essays on literary criticism in Anthem, in The Fountainhead, and in Atlas Shrugged, they're very good. I mean, superb in general. But the ones in The Fountainhead are, and particularly romanticism, I forget the title actually, the Fountainhead as a romantic novel, is really superb. So I was very pleased when I received an email from Leonard Peikoff a few months ago. Don't tell my students because I lower their grade if I see them with their phone more than once. And here's what Leonard wrote. Quote, I want to write to Tora Buchman congratulating him for his article on romanticism in the Fountainhead collection. I think it is superlative. I learned a lot from it. I was truly blown away by the quality of his intellectual analysis combined with the clarity of his presentation. So I was glad that Tora kind of got that recognition because for health reasons he's retired from intellectual pursuit or from writing serious stuff with it, which is a real tragedy. But we have what he wrote, and since it was one of my motivations at the time in starting this collection, yeah, I'm glad to get that kind of attention from Dr. Peikoff. I'll also mention I really liked, this is kind of the historian of ideas in me, that I liked Shoshona's essays on the drafts of the novels, what was going on. And some of my favorites to write were, I wrote an essay comparing the 2 versions of We the Living, where I actually noted every time Ayn Rand removed or added a comma, and I had a book that was including all that. Which was, for the kind of scholarly nerd in me that likes ancient manuscripts and things like that, it was a pretty cool project. Well, cool might not be the word, but I enjoyed it. Yeah, I could go on and on with kind of my favorites and stuff, but I think that covers that.
Would you either of you like to add to particular essays that stand out for you that haven't been mentioned?
Yeah, I'm very proud of the pieces I wrote for the Anthem book and the 2 for the Atlas Shrugged book. The ones that stood out to me as a reader were Tora's pieces, and particularly the one on romanticism that Robert mentioned, and Ankar's pieces, and particularly 2 of Ankar's pieces. The one in the We the Living book, I think there are 2 in the second edition of the We the Living book, but the one on the death premise in We the Living and Atlas Shrugged, I think is a tremendous piece, and really clarifying about a theme that's running through all of Ayn Rand's thinking about the nature of morality and specifically of evil. And also his piece in the Fountainhead book on the motivation, I think it's the motivation of the creators in the second hand, but anyway, it's on the character's motivation. And I think that's also a really profound piece philosophically. So those 3, I think, are the biggest, and Tora on romanticism and those 2 by Ankar. Also, I'll mention Darrell Wright's pieces in the Atlas and Anthem volumes.
Yeah, so in Anthem, I particularly liked both the Greg piece and the Darrell piece. And again, in part because I always found that book, it's, because it's so abstract and it's so much more like a poem or something, like to get this, what's going on with the I and discovering the I. And yeah, I found the essays by you, and I think it's Darrell, in there on that, very, very helpful. And another of Ankar's that I recently reread was, I think, on free will and determinism in We the Living. That's really good.
And so for the people watching us on recording, we're taping this episode of New Idea live here at OCON, which is the world's largest gathering of fans of Ayn Rand, taking place in Anaheim. And I mention that because the preceding keynote from our CEO, Tal Tzfani, was reliant on an essay that you had written, Greg, in the Atlas collection. So it's an interesting way in which this is a good example of how the scholarship that you conducted then created greater clarity for Tal in his presentation of the Institute's vision and how we approach the tactical work of making ARU more effective and growing that. So thanks for that, and on behalf of Tal, I guess, to do that.
Yeah, thanks. I remember Tal and I had a call maybe a month ago, and he said he was doing this talk, and he was looking for quotes illustrating a certain thing in Atlas. I said, oh, well, I've already collected them all in this piece, so you might want to look at it. And then he did, I really enjoyed that talk.
Good. All right, so I'd like to close this portion and turn to another celebration. So before I do that, I just want to say a personal thank you to each of you for the contributions you made to those books and the other authors, because I personally have learned an incredible amount from those, and it's hard for me to imagine where we would be without those books right now in terms of the growth and the ability for young scholars to advance.
I think the initiative that Robert, we talk about entrepreneurs in many areas, not so much in the intellectual arena, but no, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try to get a damn publisher to do this, and we're so glad you did.
Yeah.
So thank you.
All right, our second celebration is the publication of the First Amendment, Essays on the Imperative of Intellectual Freedom. You can see it behind me, and it's published June 16th, today. This is your publication day.
Good.
Congratulations.
There you go. Okay, champagne tonight. Good.
I would like to start by, I'll open it up to you in a moment, but I want to go through, and this is one of the biggest books we've published at ARI Press. So last year we brought out Dr. Peikoff's Founders of Western Philosophy, which is only half of that lecture course, but it's a big book. This is a really substantial book. There's a lot in here, so I encourage all of you to go explore it. And then the very first page you open has advanced praise for this book from, I won't read you what they say, but some of the individuals who read the manuscript and volunteered endorsements. Nadine Strawson, who was a former UCLA president. Floyd Abrams, who's argued cases before the Supreme Court. He's a very well-known lawyer of First Amendment. Pano Canelos, who's the president of University of Austin. And Harvey Silverglate, who is a renowned advocate of free speech. He's a lawyer. Well done, Tara. Thank you for doing this work. So let's talk about what's in this book. Tell us a bit about the genesis, and then we can dive into some of the aspects of it that are distinctive.
So it's a sort of, I don't know. 4 of the pieces are pieces that I had previously published on issues of the First Amendment in law reviews. So 2 of them on freedom of religion, 2 of them on freedom of speech. Again, the book is the First Amendment. It's not just freedom of speech. And I liked those 4 essays that I had written, and they were published. But I had thought for a while, to get a bigger audience, it would be nice to have them in book form, and maybe I could write an additional piece or 2. But it wasn't anything I was really motivated to do anytime soon. But this idea had been in the back of my mind for a while. But then I thought, but if we, maybe I can get ARI involved. And, Ankar has that really good piece on the separation of church and state, the wall of separation, that was published in one of the books that you edited, the 2 of you edited, The Foundations of a Free Society. And I know Greg has been giving some lectures on free speech issues in recent years. So maybe we can get, but again, I didn't want to organize this. But I said something to Elan, and Elan took the bait, and he truly, he made this happen. But it's a nice case of collaboration of, again, your tax dollars or your ARI dollars, or this would not have come to life if it had not been for you. And then you added this good idea of, why don't we have an interview with the contributors? So we got you guys to agree to do something or potentially write something new. So at any rate, you've got 3 essays in there on freedom of religion, 3 on freedom of speech. The one, brand new essay is Greg's, and a real virtue of that is that it is extremely timely. I mean, he was literally finishing it just within the last couple of months, and he addresses cancel culture and protests and academic freedom and so many of the things that are absolutely live today. But again, I'll just go back to, there's also this roundtable discussion that Elan conducted with the 3 of us, conducted about a year ago, but that comments a lot more directly on Ayn Rand's unique perspective on issues of intellectual freedom and how it applies to some of the current issues. I thought there was more I was going to say about that.
Yeah, so one thing on the audience then that would be worth talking about. So I mentioned the people who gave endorsements to the book, scholars in the field, people who are doing work on First Amendment thinking and advocacy. I mentioned that because I think of this book as a crossover for people who are doing scholarship and also activism, but then for the interested layperson who's not a scholar. So I think one of the things I loved about this project and all of your essays that I could understand that they were published in law review journals, but they were accessible. They were really meant for someone who's not in the field, but it's still rigorous.
They
right?
are, they are very much. I mean, one of the pieces on free speech is about the language in which we talk about free speech. What do people mean by absolute? Or what do they mean when they say, but there's an exception or censorship? And those are very much directed for, the intelligent layperson, but who wants to really understand these things more deeply. Yeah. But also, I'll just say, this goes back in a way to the books versus articles and things. The articles were out there. The articles were accessible. You could get like law review articles you can usually find online for free and everything. But they're it's like scholars who are going to go digging for a law review article. If you put them in book form, it makes them more easily, more readily available to more people who can stumble upon them, who can find them. But also, I mean, I really want to promote the hell out of this goddamn book because we so need it. So if you have speaking opportunities for us, especially in the fall when colleges are back in session, give us the idea, because one or more of us would be happy to speak at these things. And I'm again forgetting what I was going to say. Sorry.
Let me jump to you, Greg, and since you wrote this piece for the book, and maybe you could tell us a bit about what is the thrust of your article and connect it to the importance of this issue for us.
So my article, I have to remember what it's called now. I think it's called Free Speech as a Right and a Way of Life. Mm-hmm. And so I've been concerned by the free speech movement, that it's too often based on some wrong philosophical premises, particularly too much relying on John Stuart Mill, but also advocating things that just I don't think are right. And yet the responses to that I don't think are quite right either. And in particular, there's this idea that free speech is about institutions, employers, social media companies, whatever it might be, universities, having policies whereby they're pleased to accept speech on a wide range of issues. They're embracing intellectual diversity. They're not, quote, censoring by getting rid of or marginalizing speech that they don't like. And that is kind of conflated with or put as a version of the same thing that the First Amendment right is protecting. So there's the idea that government can violate free speech and also private parties can in all these ways by being intolerant, to go back to the kind of ideas Ankar was talking about, by failing to sanction or removing their sanction from certain kinds of speech. And it's been central to my way of thinking about free speech since as long as I've thought about it, that taking seriously what you give your sanction to in different ways, what kind of speech you will and won't associate with, and the ways in which you will associate it, that is an expression of and central to the right to free speech. It's a part of the exercise of the right to free speech and not any kind of violation or contrast with that principle. And yet there surely are unjust, foolish, bad ways to exercise that right, just as there are foolish and unjust ways to exercise your right to speak. You could say horrible things. So we're in a period where there's a kind of new and rising censoriousness around certain issues. Views about trans matters, whether I agree with them or not, but that everybody would have agreed with 5 minutes ago. Suddenly, if someone says them, they're like, someone out of the Middle Ages. Think of how J.K. Rowling has been treated by a lot of people. And likewise on dozens of other issues. There's something very strange and knee-jerk about the kinds of responses you get under the heading of cancel culture. And there were a lot of people responding back to those. This is horrible, we have to have more freedom of speech. But in the same manner that Ayn Rand was criticizing the communists who were going on about their free speech rights being violated when people wanted to fire them over being communists. So I was interested in how do we understand this issue? How do we understand what's wrong with the censoriousness that we're seeing in some quarters in a way that connects it to the right to free speech and the values behind it, but doesn't equate them. And related to that, how do we acknowledge that there are things that aren't done by government, but are real violations of the right to free speech, such as the violent shouting down of other speakers, the occupying of spaces, which isn't done by a government, but it is done by people and are really violating the rights of the other individuals when they're doing that, all the kind of horrors that we're seeing in the pro-Hamas, anti-Israel kinds of rallies now. So how does one integrate all of that? And so that's what the paper is about, and it deals a lot with the right to free speech, with violations of the right to free speech, both by governments, but also by vigilantes and terrorists, both Islamists, but also I talk a lot about lynch justice in the American South and the violence that was perpetrated against individualists, people trying to defend the individual rights of black Americans. And then moving into the present, talking about what it's like to, what Mill is right about, because there are some things he's right about the values of encountering diverse opinions and how laws against free speech stifle that, but also certain social practices can make it hard to engage with other people's opinions and learn what you need to learn from them. What values are legitimate there, and how is it in an individualistic rather than collectivistic way that people can pursue those values, integrating them with other values that they need to pursue, including the values of agreement and alignment that you need to have with people if you're going to work with them. What rationality and looks like in that pursuit, and then how the right to free speech properly understood to include the right to associate and dissociate based on your speech, how that right protects and makes possible that kind of activity. So that's what the paper's about.
So earlier in the conversation, we were talking about the books of essays that Robert edited. Greg, you made this comment about how those books made Ayn Rand's thought the subject of scholarship. And I think this book from Utah is the contrasting position, which is it's using her framework to understand an issue. So I wonder if you could give us a few examples of the ways in which Ayn Rand's distinctive perspective on intellectual freedom infuses this book, or aspects of it that colored your thinking.
So in terms of ways in which it infuses or is clearly visible in the book, I think very much so in Greg's essay and in the roundtables where we're all discussing, because what we really, I think, bring out there is the best defenders of free speech today are all basically Millians. They all like their godfather is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was a utilitarian and a collectivist, and there's no way around that, and the arguments that he gives for free speech are basically society is better off. That's not the justification for free speech, and you're not going to get free speech out of that. You're not going to get any intellectual freedom out of that. So I think a real theme that comes through many of the discussions in the collection is the individualistic, you have a right to your life, to say whatever you want, to pray to whatever God you want, or whatever. But so it's getting the much more individually rooted source of the importance of intellectual freedom. So that's a real distinctive feature, I guess, in terms of bringing out the Rand. Yeah. And trying to show that to people. For a long time, many of us have been saying, like, Mill is not the friend of free speech that you thought he was. But, Greg is just like, he's anti-free speech. And it's like, yeah, it's helpful to have it said in those it's like, this is not freedom of speech. So we need to go back to what do we mean by freedom and what is, yeah.
On that point, there's someone I should credit because he's the first person I heard that idea from, and we've since published him on it, which is Robert Garmong gave a series of lectures at the first Objectivist conference I went to. He wrote a dissertation on Mill, on this issue in Mill, and nothing ever came of that for a long time afterwards. But when Robert and I were editing our book on Foundations of a Free Society, I reached out to Bob and said, this has not been published. Can you do it? And he wrote a nice essay for us on that topic in that book that's been published. So he's another.
And let me add a different sort of dimension of this. So I mentioned earlier, 3 of the essays are on freedom of religion. And my thinking on that was, my thinking on all of these things has been very influenced by Ayn Rand. But one thing I'll say is, I think my 2 essays on religion in this book are better than the 2 essays on speech, so for what it's worth. Okay. Also, religious freedom and its misunderstanding these days are big, big threats. Look at Alabama, look at the IVF rulings, look at a lot of the Supreme Court rulings in recent years. There's a very odd and I think misguided take on what religious freedom means and doesn't mean, and we need to be on guard against that. So pay attention to the stuff on religious freedom in there. But one of those essays, it's called something like, "What Good is Religious Freedom? Locke, Rand, and the Non-Religious Case for It," or something like that. But I talk very directly about Rand in that essay, and it's her analysis of how if you're not thinking, if you're not doing your own thinking, if the state is telling you what you may and may not think, in this context more with religious issues, you can't have a rational thought, you can't have your own life, and that's what, so I play up on that theme, and I actually go into that fairly carefully, that is, the way in which force blocks a mind from thinking any good constructive thoughts and getting at things. So
This is the title is, and I like this title, so I'm going to read it out. What good is religious freedom? Locke, Rand, and the non-religious case for respecting it. I want to say one thing, or ask you one thing about the subtitle. So it's framed in terms of intellectual freedom, and a lot of the topics that we think about in the news are couched in terms of freedom of speech or cancel culture and so on. So maybe you could give us, just broaden the context for us a bit and explain how you think of intellectual freedom and where free speech fits into that.
So, and this was something I really got from Encore many years ago, but what the First Amendment is about is intellectual freedom in various of its permutations or possible applications, and what, your mind and what you think, and then what you get to say about it, what you get to publish, right to free press. I get to kneel to this God or pray to that God or no God or whatever, or speak or assemble with others or petition with others, because we have this idea, government, that you've wronged us, so we're going to petition you for redress of grievances and so on. So, just pretty broadly, I think pretty straightforwardly, I think of intellectual freedom as the freedom of the mind to think what it wants to think and to act accordingly. It's all of a piece. It's all just another reflection of your freedom. Your right to your life, to lead your life, to be free, to lead your life however you like, in material transactions, in intellectual exchange, but intellectual exchange not just for its own sake, for carrying out in action what you do. But again, I think people don't have an understanding of freedom as the foundation, even for freedom of speech, though they use the term. Rather, they have the more Millian idea, it's the social good. We're all better off. So, there are truths to the observations, as a matter of fact, of what will often come from freedom of speech, but that's not the justification for it. It's in the nature of freedom, and that's what Ayn Rand really shows us. So we went back and forth about the title of the book in the beginning. Originally, I was very wedded to a quote from a Supreme Court justice, "What shall be orthodox?" because there's a famous ruling in which Justice Jackson, but I ended up, I had already used that as the preface to one of the articles, and we thought, well, let's not use that again. And for searchability, you have to care about searchability these days. The First Amendment, having that somewhere in the title. So here we are.
One of the things I took away from reading this book is what should have been more obvious to me, I suppose, is the natural fit for why Ayn Rand was so passionate about intellectual freedom. So the author of Atlas Shrugged, which is lionizing the role of the mind in human life, it's such a natural connection. So, and that's part of what excited me about reading it and learning from it. So I have a few more questions for you, and I want to prompt the audience here. If you have questions for our panelists, we would love you to take the mic. I think it's right here, and we'll field as many of those as we can. So to bring some of these threads together, let me ask you about the future and what. So part of what has come out in this conversation is that intellectual work is crucial to an intellectual movement and advancing ideas and the substantive, deep scholarship, different kinds of audiences, and that gives some color to what Ayn Rand meant when she said it's the permanent fuel. This is what keeps a movement alive and vital and attractive and powerful and illustrates its value. So I'm curious from your perspective, and what would you love to see future scholars, young scholars today, who I'm not sure they're ready to do this kind of work, but what's some projects or topics you'd love to see new projects written about from the perspective of Ayn Rand's philosophic framework? And then so that's one kind of topic, if you have thoughts on that. And then the other kind of topic, what other kinds of scholarship on Ayn Rand do you think would be wonderful to see people do? So maybe more specialized collections around different topics, but let me open it up to you guys if you have thoughts on that. And this is my agenda, I'll just be open about it. One of my goals is to energize young people who are passionate about becoming intellectuals and to emphasize for them that there's an incredible amount of work to be done, and it's exciting, and it's there to be pursued. So that's where I'm coming from.
Well, I find it hard to answer in part because I think the future is kind of woozy. I mean, that is, I think 10 or 20 years ago, I would have thought what I'd really like to see is serious objectivist philosophers, for example, writing articles in philosophy journals. Mm-hmm. I don't know, and maybe Greg has a view of this, and Tara, I don't know how important that is to the ultimate success of objectivism anymore. I mean, it used to be the idea that until we get into the universities and are taken seriously there, we don't have a chance. The world is kind of, the situation is weirder now or different in any event. So I would still like to see that, but part of me doesn't know how important that is anymore. And I have further thoughts on what I'd like to see published, but I think you guys should talk.
Mm-hmm. So I think we had a little bit of a mistaken view about what that would look like, both in academic philosophy publications like journals and books published by university presses, and in more popular forums. So what I imagined would be very important 20 years ago were a bunch of articles in philosophy journals or books from philosophy presses, Ayn Rand's view of this, or the objectivist conception of that. And I no longer think that's the kind of central thing. We have some good books and journals like that, so part of it is that we've done it. But it's those kinds of works, even when they could be published by a university press or by something that's read in a philosophy journal or whatever, are just inherently only going to be of interest to people who are already interested in Ayn Rand. Just suppose somebody had, I don't know, some other figure you're not antecedently interested in's view of something, Bonaventure's view of political freedom or something. If you don't care about Bonaventure, you're not going to care about his view on that. So you have to be antecedently motivated. What those works are good for is the people who are already interested in Rand and interested in kind of academic scholarly things and showing you that there's a connection between something you might not have realized. And so I think they're really valuable, but they're really valuable largely as a supply chain for something else. And there's something else that they're valuable for is books about free speech, articles about various issues in philosophy that are not about Ayn Rand, that are not such that you have to be interested in Ayn Rand already to be interested in them, that are just about the world and reality, but that are powered by a deep understanding of Ayn Rand. Maybe the result of someone's reading it will that they'll then get interested in Ayn Rand. But the goal of it isn't to interest people in Ayn Rand. It's to set people straight on the topic and move the world. And part of that should be then getting them to think about, well, where did this come from? And I'm not saying, hide the objectivism, but that's not the selling point and it's not the center. So I think we need a lot more work that's applying objectivist ideas to various issues, but that are about the issues, that are motivated on the issues, and yet that are informed by a very deep understanding of objectivism. And this scholarly work on objectivism is, again, part of the supply chain for that. I think we need that kind of work over a range of genres and places. So I think we do need academic journal articles and philosophy articles written to other philosophers who are then teaching students and so forth that are doing that. And I have a list of issues that I think would be really valuable to have it on. But I think we also need it in popular history books, in books about, in books about, for example, Israel and Palestine, of which there's an excellent one, timely, written a bit before this year, and so I think a great thing for people to look back to. And for people who don't know, I'm referring to Elan's book, What Justice Demands, which was published a year or two ago.
2018.
Years ago. 2018? Okay, so time compresses as you start to get older. Robert, that I have. But anyway, prior to the recent war. So I think we need more of that, and for popular books, I think we need a lot more of it conceptualizing history and both recent history and longer-term history. There are all of these books like Dominion and various books, a lot of them by right-wingers, some of them by left-wingers, on understanding American history, understanding Western civilization or civilization. How do you see the fault lines and dividing lines? Almost all of them are bad, or they contain a lot of good information, but it's deeply misconceptualized. I think we need a lot of material doing that kind of work. Within philosophy, there are literatures that I think are promising and in some ways moving in the right direction, but that need integration. There's new things that need to be done in them, and there's really powerful applications of objectivism, particular to the literature that's developing on well-being. So I think there need to be work on well-being by objectivists, and indeed some of the work on well-being that's already popular has been contributed to by people who have an objectivist influence, but I don't think are very deeply objectivist in their understanding of it. So I'd like to see more of that. There are a few other topics in political philosophy and elsewhere.
I'll add a few subjects, so not so much on the question of should it be in a philosophy journal or in this kind of format or that, but I think we need more good scholarship on a number of subjects, and these are just some things, largely this is just some stuff I'm interested in, but I'd love to see more work done on privacy, both as a personal individual value and some of the legal questions about Fourth Amendment and search, and everybody's very concerned with privacy of their medical information and their data of different sorts and so on. Property, and this is something that we've talked about a little bit, and it even relates to privacy, but I think there's a lot of work still to be done on really digging into property and its relationship to just the very right to life. And I also think, still in the legal realm, I'd love to see the objectivist epistemology applied more to evidence in the law, standards, burdens of proof, standards of evidence. I think there's room there for some really good work to be done. I'm interested in things like the jury system. And again, I think bringing to, how do we know things? And how do we figure out the best way to know what we want to know when we want to figure out who done it in, the murder trial or whatever. And I will say, just getting back for a moment to where you can publish this stuff, I have continued to find people in the law a little bit more movable and potential influence in the law than in philosophy proper. But we need good history. We need people who can analyze events, from the long historical past. We just need more people in history and historiography and how to do history I'm interested in. We need more, we need good journalism. So even some theoretical stuff on what it is and what it's not. And so they're just a variety of things. And these are all very personal interests to me. There's other worthwhile things to do, but there's a lot to do.
Yeah. And I'd like to do more work on what in academia is called the philosophy of religion. I think objectivism has a lot to offer to, Ayn Rand's a much better atheist than the atheists that are out there and that are writing on the subject. And objectivism has more to offer to kind of discussions of the argument for the existence of God, the relationship between reason and faith, the problem of evil. There's so much that one could do. And I'd like to do some. I've been giving talks on those kinds of subjects and would like to do something more. Well, I think you made the point that it doesn't really exist until it's a book. So.
Oh.
All right, well, let's turn to you. I would love to hear questions. The mic is over here, and you can take turns. And tell us, first, ground rules for questions. Question needs to have a question mark at the end, not a comment. And tell us if you're directing it to a particular panelist or if it's open to everybody. So let's take the first question. Yes?
Open to everyone. I'm interested to hear any thoughts you have about self-publishing versus going to an academic press. I know sometimes, like Elan's book, you didn't publish it in-house with ARI Press, you had another one, but some of your books are published in-house. Mm-hmm. What is the value of still going to an academic publisher versus self-publishing? Yeah, I guess that's
okay. Can I just say before, on that in particular, it's not an academic publisher or self-publishing. There are commercial, like trade presses. Mm-hmm. There are academic presses, and there's self-publishing, and maybe there are more things to those.
Like Lexington Press did Robert's books.
But Penguin would be like a commercial.
Yeah, Penguin, but
Random House.
Random House. Yeah. 10 years ago, an objectivist asked me what I thought about self-publishing, and I said it's like taking your cousin to the prom. It had that kind of, it had that feel to it. You know, that's not, it doesn't count. You've not really achieved anything. I wouldn't have that view nowadays because I think, now maybe it wasn't 10 years ago, maybe it's compression. But there was a time when, I mean, in academia, you called it a vanity press. You went to someone who, there were no standards really, you paid them some money. That's different now, I think, with Amazon and these other ways of acquiring. Now, personally, I don't like the idea, at least for the work that I do in ancient philosophy, certainly. But I mean, I would either go to an academic press or I would try, if it were appropriate, to go the Ayn Rand University Press or what have you. But I would say that if you want a big audience, you might consider trying an academic press. Or I say academic press because usually you can write to them directly. You find the acquisition editor in philosophy, say, and you send them a proposal. Whereas you can't do that with Penguin or with Random House. You have to go through an agent. That's my understanding. And then self-publishing is, I don't know anything about that except that some people have had a lot of success with that. And I think it's reached the point where the book can speak for itself. I think Dr. Binswanger's book, How We Know, is self-published, but...
It depends, too, on, like, what are you trying to do with the book? Who do you really want to read this book or for this book to register with? So while I agree with Robert that the stigma of self-publishing has diminished, I don't think it's dissolved, and certainly hasn't in my own mind. Mm-hmm. I mean, it doesn't look nearly as good to me if it's self-published as if it's certified by somebody else. Now, that's an initial impression, right? My initial impression is it doesn't look as good to me. I might read the book and find this much better than like most of the stuff I read from renowned publishers and so on. But there is still going to be, I think, for a lot of people, an initial little aura of, like, why is this self-published? So I don't think it's dissolved, though it definitely is diminished over the years. And there are just practical advantages these days of self-publishing, the ability to get it out. Because, I mean, when you're at the mercy of publishers, you get a lot of rejection letters. And get it out quickly and on terms that, you can, and I've learned some of this by publishing this book with ARI. Yeah.
One of the things you have to think about is if you're writing something, there's the problem of marketing it. You have to market it. You have to get it out to people. And there are two ways in which presses can help with that, or are supposed to be able to help with that. One is a press with a reputation, having accepted it, is a signal. It's like, a signal that it's considered good by certain people who you might respect. Now, the more our respect and the respect of the population in general dims on certain presses and certain institutions, the less that signal helps. But self-publishing is just the absence of any signal, or maybe the signal that you couldn't get that from anyone. So that's one thing, the signal which helps in the marketing. And then the other is they actually can help market. They can get it in bookstores. They can put up ads. They could, send it out to places to try to get reviews of it and so forth. They could advertise for it.
More likely to get it in libraries.
Right, more likely to
sometimes.
get it into libraries. So more presses these days, I gather, are doing less and less of that and expecting the author to do more and more of that than was true in the past. But nonetheless, they do some of it. And whether you have a press or you self-publish, you have to give some thought to, how am I going to get people to read this book? I could just put it up on my blog or have it sitting, in my front yard and invite people to come over. Like, unless people have some way to get it, to find out about it, to have it advertised to them, they're not going to read it. And so you're thinking about whether to have a press, what press, how to deal with them, should be part of a wider project of thinking about, how am I marketing this book to whom? And then, do I want to go into business with these guys to help me do it? They have some expertise I don't. They might have some reach that I don't, and et cetera.
Thank you.
We have a question from online.
Okay.
Jeffrey from the chat would like to know what the panel's reactions are to First Amendment auditors. Those are individuals who record police, and what the panel thinks of the police's retaliations to people who try to record them. So, for example, he's worried about police telling.
Police what? I'm sorry.
We lost you.
Telling Mohammed, you've gone silent.
So
Well,
is the issue of people videotaping police in action and in effect being exposing what's happening, police conduct? That looks like a thumbs up. Okay. Do you guys have any reaction or thoughts on that? I'm not very familiar with it.
I think it's... Go ahead, Tara.
All I was going to say is, as soon as you say retaliation, that sounds suspicious, right? If the police are in some way penalizing a person for observing what he observes, that doesn't sound legitimate. Now, what you always want to keep in mind is, okay, the cop is making an arrest, I turn on my camera. How much of what I got gets the whole story? Images can be very misleading and so on. So there's obviously dangers of that and bad faith uses of my taping what's going on and all. Anyway, the idea of retaliation against that on the part of the police is unfortunately all too real. Like, you see this in a variety of areas, kind of police retaliation for certain behavior that in itself is, if and when it's non-obstructive of what the police need to be doing, seems okay.
Okay. Let's jump back to the audience.
The three of you are professors at universities, and I hope you heard Tal's talk, but he basically said there's no future in universities in humanities, and we need to abandon
but we have
it.
tenure, or some...
I don't.
Yeah, no. So I would really like to hear your opinion and maybe your story on why you chose academic path and not in ARI, and what do you think is the future of academia?
When we were young, ARI wasn't hiring.
Right. Yeah.
No.
So they weren't.
Well, yeah, there weren't those kinds of opportunities.
ARI was like 3 people when we were young.
Yeah. We're older than you think. Sorry. I chose it because it was a possibility. I think there's a lot of bad stuff in academia, largely the ideas, but it's a wonderful life if you can get it. To be a college professor, I enjoy that very much. You get a lot of freedom, a lot of free time. I can work on the projects I want. I can pretty much teach what I want. But it was, you get the PhD, you go on the job market, you get some interviews, and it's kind of, in the end of the process, I had one job offer, and it's the one I took, and it's where I am. It's risky. And my understanding is it's riskier now. It's a tough market out there.
In philosophy in particular.
In philosophy, in the humanities generally.
Yeah.
I was just on a search committee for a classics position. It's getting desperate out there. So it's not, of the, many offers out there, why did I choose this rather than ARI? ARI wasn't hiring. They weren't
At
in a
all,
position.
yeah.
They weren't growing that way. So for me, it was find this, get a position, a tenure track job, ultimately, or I don't know what
And I
the
think-
plan B was. I didn't have one. But.
So, and Robert and I came out of grad school at about, I mean, maybe within a year of each other or something like that. And this is like 89, 90, something like that. So there was no option of working for ARI. But also, so on the one hand, I very much agree. I think we're in agreement that we both really like our academic lives. I love teaching and I love the research and having a lot of time for the research and writing. Like, I really enjoy that both. I enjoy being on a campus with a lot of people whose future is in front of them and who, whatever a lot of their confused philosophies, have some good ideas and good ambitions and want to make things. Like, I like that environment. And it wasn't, and I don't think it for you either, but don't let me speak for you here. I mean, I wasn't thinking, how can I help objectivism? I was thinking, what do I want to do with my life? I really like this ideas stuff. I could make a living working in ideas, trying to answer these questions that I have. Ooh, and doing some teaching, and I enjoy. That was great. So, so hopefully I can stay here. I mean, for now, I'm liking it here yet. Though I did like that ARU teaching this semester, so maybe I can talk to Tal about doing more of that.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that as well. In my case, my passion was ancient philosophy, and I was an objectivist who wanted to be a historian of ancient philosophy, and that's certainly the people hiring those people are universities.
So Robert's comment gives me a bridge to what I want to say. On this, the nature of knowledge, the work involved in forming and passing on knowledge, the kind of specialization that work requires, and the way the universities are integrated in with all our other institutions of preserving and passing on knowledge and developing knowledge are such that you cannot fully give up on the universities without fully giving up on the society altogether. And by that I mean wanting the whole society to literally be burning, half of our knowledge to disappear. It's too integrated for that. Now, that doesn't mean we should accept the universities as there are. That doesn't mean everybody should go into universities. It doesn't mean people should be donating to universities, at least without lots of strings attached. And I think there are certain strings you can attach that make it right to donate to them, but it's got to be, and it doesn't mean that you should go to a university as a student uncritically. But you shouldn't go to ARU as a student uncritically or give a check to ARI uncritically either. You should have a view of what you want and need out of it, what you're trying to learn, why you're trying to learn it, how it's going to integrate into your life. And I definitely think that a path to cultural change requires a lot of work to be done outside of the universities, independent of it, separately from it. Requires alternative institutions, online, in person. I think Tal's idea for like a gap year, for example, is really excellent. But the path to changing the culture includes changing the universities. The question is just which things does one push on and expect to make which progress on which timescales. And the universities themselves are changing in all kinds of ways as technology and the means of sharing ideas change. So they're going to change for better, worse, or laterally, independent of us. A plan for changing the culture, for interacting with and improving a developing culture, includes a view of how, at what stages, and in what ways you're going to interact with that.
So do you think that universities today have some advantage over ARI in some respects? And
of course.
ARI's future plans?
If you want to learn how to make the next mRNA vaccine, or the next kind of breakthrough in science equivalent to that.
No, in philosophy. I mean, in philosophy and...
But start with that. If you want to do that kind of specialized knowledge in a specialized field, there's no way to get that and to learn how to do that other than going to a university. Then, while you're there are going to be ideas that are discussed. So if you want to be someone who's teaching philosophy to the people who are figuring out how to make the next mRNA vaccine, and they're going to be in a university and they're going to be required university classes, one thing to do is to try to be the one teaching philosophy. Another thing to do is to be trying to reach those people through independent channels, which I think both of those things need to be done by different people and by maybe some of the same people who are trying to do both. And I'm trying to function on both channels.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So the line for questions is likely longer than the time we have. So don't just stay in the line, but we'll see how far we get. Just want to give you notice of that. I'll ask you to put your question in the most succinct way, and I'm going to ask you guys to be maybe a little briefer in your responses so we can get through more of these. Welcome. Yes.
My wife is currently reading her first novel by Ayn Rand, and I'd like to hear your opinion to such a person. Would it be beneficial for her to move on to the scholar on the Fountainhead, or should she go to the more traditional, usual path of continuing to Atlas Shrugged and then moving on?
What is the first novel that she's reading?
Currently, she's reading The Fountainhead, and I thought I should recommend her. I'm considering the option to recommend her to go to the book about The Fountainhead that was shown in the beginning.
I'd go to Atlas Shrugged as soon as possible. No, I mean that. I think, and then at a certain point, read the essay collections. I mean, that certainly will be valuable. But I think, first of all, in reading the essays on the Fountainhead, there would be plot spoilers. There are comparisons to things happening in Atlas Shrugged. So.
Yeah, I think the only secondary thing related to any of Ayn Rand's literature that it's worth reading before you've read at least Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, but arguably the other two, is the Atlas Project, which is something that Ben Bayer and I recorded, and it's a kind of podcast that goes through Atlas Shrugged chapter by chapter that I think is worth listening to along with Atlas. Or anyway, it's devised to be such that you could listen to it or watch it as you're reading Atlas and not get spoilers for what's ahead of you and not get spoilers for her other works. So that's the only thing that I think is safe in that way. And I would say if you're looking for enrichment materials, the only novel that's got it is Atlas, and that's the one I would use.
Thanks.
Next.
One of my personal values is effective teams. The work you do has both urgency but has to be uncompromising, correct? ARI is a team, and I'm interested to know your method as a team for determining that a written work is ready to be released.
I guess that's a question for me. We have very rigorous internal standards. I'm one of the senior editors for our journal, New Ideal, and Onkar Ghate is the final editor on content that we produce. So Onkar is the person who sets direction and standards, and I take direction from him, and when there are questions about is a piece ready, and if I don't think my judgment's I'm competent to judge it because it's not my area, I turn to Onkar. That's the short answer. I can tell you more if you want to follow up with me, more about the processes internally. Yeah.
On the topic of health of intellectual movements and the books that help fuel them, I'm wondering what kind of gauges you use to evaluate whether or not a book or a movement is being successful. Is it raw sales? Is it appearing in certain places and being talked about in academia? Is it, just widespread reading and appreciation?
Well, in the case of the essays collections, it definitely wasn't sales. It was the fact that, I knew people were reading them and were getting something out of them, and I knew that they were having an influence of the sort that Greg described earlier. So that's speaking for myself.
I mean, I think ideally you'd like your books to be discussed. Now, writing an academic book like my egoism book that just came out, in some ways it's very much for objectivists. In other ways it is still an academic book, and I'm also trying to speak to academics. I would really like for some academics to pick up on it and discuss it some and get it into the discussions of well-being, which is one of the subjects that Greg mentioned that academic philosophers do. Simultaneously, I will say, as I just mentioned, yeah, it's largely for objectivists, and it's extremely gratifying to hear objectivists say they're reading it and they're really getting something out of it. I mean, that's in a way why I wrote it. So, I mean, it just varies with the book. Like the First Amendment book, I'd like to get that in the hands of more people who can, you can maybe get to open their eyes about Mill is not the way to defend this and religious freedom, and so varies a little bit.
I'd just like to offer one quick thing, which is I think you're raising a very broad question. We think a lot about at the Institute. It's a difficult question to answer. I will offer a couple of things that are signals, and I think it's useful to think of them as signals you would want to see in different parts of the culture. Because if I understood the question correctly, is can you tell when a movement's having an impact? You can look at other movements and see their growth. So contemporary examples around sort of the anti-racism movement that's sprung up and supplanted genuine movements against racism. And that's been a trajectory you can trace, and you can understand how its effect has been seen. If you take that perspective on objectivism, there are many signals you would want to look for. So some of them are the discussion of objectivist books, the citing of articles, and the publication. I think you would also want to look at things like the kinds you mentioned. I wouldn't take just raw numbers as a signal. I would take it as a preliminary indication that there is interest or that you've got some traction. And I think it's important that there be continual search for those kinds of signals. And then it isn't passive, it's something you have to pursue. So I think it's important, someone earlier asked about publishing, and it's important to think about strategies for publishing. But as Greg pointed out, and I just want to amplify that point, the writing of the book is a big mountain to climb. The second mountain is getting it attention, engaging people in it, and connecting with other people in a field or scholars or activists. And that kind of work is part of what intellectual work is about. So that would be another kind of signal that you would want to look for. So there are people now, I think a former colleague, Alex Epstein, has written 2 books. You can see some of the influence of his thinking on people. He's not a movement, he's someone in a movement, but that's the kind of small example that you can think of, but you would want a lot of different kinds of examples of a movement's impact in different areas, academic, non-academic. So I hope that's helpful. I think we'll make this the final question. I'm sorry at the end, but you follow up at the end if you wish. Yes?
So the older and busier I get, the more I see how much time it requires to really integrate everything you learn. So, among many things I do, there's like finishing my philosophy undergrad. There are Ayn Rand University classes and more like readings and things I need to do. And, I miss like teenage years when I had long hours to really think over everything I learned and how it applies to everything I have read in OPAR or whatever. But, it's not possible to do it with everything, however tempting that may be. And, integrating objectivism and philosophy and, integrating knowledge in general is what you've been doing for many years as professional philosophers. So I would really love to hear your advice on how we do that. Do you have any tricks? Do you have any schedule?
So if I take the question correctly, it's how do you as scholars use your time to learn and process knowledge? Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, like how do you make sure everything is integrated, and how do you prioritize stuff? Because you can't really chew over everything to the same extent as well, right? So
depends on what you mean by everything. I'm ignorant of a lot of stuff. Particularly, I spend a lot of time on ancient philosophy and then on my courses, and I try to keep up with objectivism. I listen to your own, and that's a major source of my news. And but yeah, I devote a lot of time, hours of my day to doing my work. But that's how I think of it. I don't think of it as in the terms you described.
I mean, you have to write certain things off. And I mean, even Tal this morning said something about focus means we don't do X, Y, and Z. So even here, and this is a little bit like what you were saying, like I know the issues I'm interested in, but that I'm most interested in. I'm going to give them the most time. But there are always satellite issues on, it's like, oh, but I'm interested in that too. Maybe not right now, or maybe not. Maybe I'll just read lightly on that for the time being, but I know that's one I want to come back to. So you kind of want to, I think it's a good idea to keep track of other things that you want to pursue further or a little bit more carefully to be giving more time to. But there's no particular trick, but I'm very time conscious and very constantly on, okay, but what's the priority here? You should really spend more time on this and less on this.
Greg?
So I talk a fair amount about this kind of thing in my course that's available online from ARI, Thinking Objectively. But I think the essence here is being at a meta level in your cognition. Knowledge is work, and work takes time. And you can't therefore know everything, because you couldn't devote time to it. But the things that and therefore you can't integrate everything, at least not in detail. But what you want to do is know what you know and what you don't know, and what you're on your way to knowing in various ways. Know what kind of work would be involved in having the fullest kind of knowledge of this, and where you are relative to each thing about it. And then not feel guilty about not having decided not to look into certain things. And then 2, you want to have some kind of a comprehensive worldview and a view maybe very sketchy for each thing you know about how it fits into that. So you know about specific things, this integrates to that, and there'd be a lot of more work to do to nail down the integration. But I know basically where it fits. And that you can do with fairly little time once you develop that perspective. And then part of that is you want to be on the lookout for signs of inconsistency. Not you run everything down to the greatest level of detail, but like what will the signal be when there's some premise that needs to be checked. So if you have those things going on, then you can fit it into your other pursuits. And indeed, it's central to all of your pursuits.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'd like to have the final word, take my privilege as the moderator, and thank you all for supporting the Institute. That has made possible some of the research that went into these books, made possible the licensing and publication of those essays that are now available online. And thanks for the work that you all have done in creating this new knowledge and in putting it into words. I know the work that takes. So thank you, each of you, for your scholarship. Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it.